Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Butterfly Effect podcast, and today we are ranking the episodes of The Walking Dead Season 2. Of course, we've just finished our analysis series, so now we're going to see what we rank them to be, all of those episodes. Before we do though, we did put out a poll just to see what the community was feeling about this. And mate, I'll throw it over to you. Do you want to share us the results?
Yeah, so thank you to the 156 people who voted in. Quite an overwhelming, lean towards A House Divided. I don't disagree, it is a great episode. Amid the Ruins takes bottom place. And you know what, mate? My ranking isn't 100% the same, but very similar. There's just a little switch in here. So yeah, I'm kind of in agreement with the people, to be honest.
Yeah, I'll say this going into mine. Top and bottom were easy picks. It's the middle three. It really is the middle three. So like mine, I think, mine's different from this. But the middle three are almost like paper thin away from one another. Like it's ridiculously close. But I ultimately did base mine on just sheer enjoyment. Like a little bit of choices does factor into my reasoning, but yeah, I just didn't base it on my overall enthusiasm for each episode.
So, as always, guys, we're going to do our classic thing where we get the gold medal, the silver, the bronze, the nothing, and the turd. And all that remains, episode 1 gets absolutely nothing. It finished 4th place for me. I'll start off with all the good stuff about this. I quite liked Omid's cinematic death in the bathroom stall. I know, Krista and Omid getting written out the story quite early. It is quite bashed on by fans, but I really like how it was done. It really sets off the tone of the series of how, somber it's going to be when the funny guy that we all like in Omid gets killed off like that. It was quite, distressing to see, and, I was a big fan of, the way it was shot. One of my favourite scenes of the entire season actually comes in this episode with the "still not bitten" quote, and how grueling that Stitch scene is when Clementine's in the shed. It's just very iconic to me, not only in season 2 but the whole of Telltale Walking Dead. I actually quite liked the sneak sequence we get in this level as well, despite the questionable morals of the group throwing you in the shed in the first place, and the questionable intelligence of the group as well. I also think this episode is great if, like you did in your stream, Jack, you play as Savage Clem, where you can, eavesdrop on Rebecca and then say, whose baby is it? And I think you should start being nice to me. I really like the start of Savage Clem. I feel like you can't really get that in season 1 because you don't play as Clem, but if you choose to be Savage Clem, it really kickstarts it and all that remains, and I think it's brilliant. And there's a few good things in this episode as well, such as the Roman Easter egg, which I appreciate. There's also some really nice Lee tributes of recapping, and I think the episode does a good job in making us miss the guy. And I think the ending's pretty solid as well. It's really tense with the fact one of the characters gets bitten. The episode falls flat in a lot of areas though. Firstly, fuck the dog scene. Why would you kill off a dog in the episode? Absolutely heartbreaking. I don't need to see that shit. If I replay the game, I absolutely dread seeing that dog because I know I'm going to have to kick it and kill it in a bit anyway. So I just hate, having to see animal cruelty in video games. I recapped on it a little bit before, but Krista and Omid being dropped like a sack of spuds. The fact as well, we never get to see Krista again. I know that does happen in the apocalypse, but I don't know. It just didn't feel that rewarding to see Krista just get dropped and never see her again. The episode had a lot of cut content, which I think it needed to breathe life into this episode. They cut a fishing scene with Alvin, which he needed because, he probably was the blandest character in the new group. And apparently they cut off a whole sequence where Clementine falls in the river and she has to dodge rocks. I think that would have been really cool to see because I think this episode does lack action. And I think as well, one thing I have to say is that I did struggle to adapt to the new theme of survival. Season 1, I always say this, we have the theme of protection because we're looking after Clementine. Now we are Clementine. It's just a survival thing, and survival's just very written to death in the zombie genre. So this whole season just felt less exciting naturally. And the last thing to shit on is the fact that Carlos is the world's shittest doctor who can't tell a human bite from a dog bite when, I don't know, I feel like I managed to deduce it at the age of 16 or however old I was. And for Carlos to call himself a doctor and then chuck you in a shed, I think is very problematic.
Wow, very interesting. So episode 1, All That Remains in my ranking, gets the silver medal. I really, really like this episode looking back. The first thing I'm going to say is I think that actually it's very well paced. Before I carry on, I'm going to quickly jump to this comment on the poll from Abdi2Time that says, the first episode, All That Remains, is honestly really good, and in my opinion it even does some episodes from season 1. My only real criticism is how they handled Omid and Krista. And yes, I completely agree with you. Like, I just think of how it starts off. First of all, we mentioned this analysis series. I love the sort of the theatre of the deaths of Omid, and obviously then it rolls into like Krista. But then the fact you've got the fight, you're then moving downriver, which is really intense, and I feel like that's actually something I'll describe this episode was, just really intense. Clem's nearly drowning, you have to kill a dog, you have to stitch up your arm, you're meeting all these people. It's just like, you know, when you're reading a book and you want to be thrown into the action, you don't want sort of the scene to be set X, Y, and Z like most pilot episodes tend to be. I love that All That Remains because you've got Clem on her own. She's having to fight against obviously the zombies and obviously navigate her way through a new group. And she's got some really like personal stakes in it as well. So I just really liked how it was paced, and actually by the time you get to then meet the house, you meet the characters, the sneaky scene, you then have like a really good choice at the end, which actually carries on into episode 2 with Pete and Nick. So yeah, like generally really, really solid entry, episode 1. Like Abdi says though, I do agree with how they handled Omid and Krista. I do like the theatrical nature of Omid's death, but then when you look at it, it is very much clearinghouse. It's like that sort of, oh, okay, we've awkwardly got season 1 characters here, we need to move them on. And actually, what Abdi goes on to say is that they had 2 very similar characters in Alvin and Rebecca, which, you know, could have been Omid and Krista throughout this entire season, and I do completely share that sentiment as well. So, surprise, surprise, episode 2, A House Divided, gets the gold medal. So, the 2 top spots have been taken up already for me here, and what can I say? It's, again, I mean, we're talking about pacing again. I like the way it feels so kinetic, this chapter. It feels like that you're constantly on the move. There's new locations to take in, but it does drip feed you with some dialogue scenes as well to naturally slow things down here and there. You're thinking like you've got the Kenny reunion. Now, before this has come out, there's people thinking, is Kenny coming back? There was rumours to it, you know, people like the odd leak here or there. But the fact you then reunite with Kenny, it does it in such a touching way as well, with the music from like Walking Dead season 1, which is just such a great nod for the, you know, the nostalgia of the relationship and everything you experience with Lee. So that was beautifully handled. I love like the moral situations that this one throws you in. How like you've got such a likable guy in Walt who's clearly lost his partner Matthew. You know about it and you're given a very important choice, which can then dictate whether Nick lives or dies. And even like in the build up to that, you've got the chat with Alvin where he's even saying maybe we need to get rid of this Nick guy. So already like it's appropriately titled A House Divided because you're already starting to see cracks within this group. And that's obviously amplified more when you've then brought Carver in for the shootout, which was just a great scene in general. I would say perhaps before that as a slight negative, there was some maybe dead scenes, you know, when you're walking around the lodge just chatting to people and that. But I think if I'm talking about sheer enjoyment, that's completely overwhelmed by all the good things about this chapter. And that shootout at the end was great, especially for me because I've only ever played it where I've lost Nick and Alvin. I've not played it where they both survive. So like the stakes were seriously high, people were losing their lives. And it was just enthralling to watch. I really, really enjoyed it. So yeah, that is basically why House Divided gets the gold medal for me.
Likewise, guys, House Divided just has to get the gold medal. I looked at a lot of other rankings just to kind of inspire my list, and a lot of people would say it was the second best episode this season. But I'm with Jack and you guys in our poll. I completely disagree. I think this one takes the cake. It is the best one. I'm going to start off with the negatives. That way I can end it on a high. Jack, titled one of his episodes The 11-Year-Old Adult. And I think it really kickstarts in this episode where you've got Luke getting, the new little girl in the group to climb a ladder to scout out how this little girl has to fix a wind turbine when there's a bunch of adults in the group. It just makes no sense. I get you have to give the player license to do all these little puzzles and tasks, but it's almost flawed logic how they're getting some 11-year-old girl to do X and Y. I agree with Jack as well. I think the ski lodge scene kind of dragged a little bit, but I do get they needed those scenes as well to water it down and kind of help with the pacing. And speaking of just how dysfunctional the group are, I know it does sometimes work and it does add a quirk having a dysfunctional group, and especially how that comes into play when Jane tries to pull you out of it and speak sense into you. But I wasn't a really big fan of the dinner scene where you've got two grown-up men sit with me, like it was a school cafeteria. I was like, grow the fuck up. I would have liked a bit more life from Alvin. I think he was the weakest character out of the group, the least memorable. So yeah, I just wanted more from him. And not necessarily a bad thing, but it potentially has the weakest cliffhanger out of the 5 episodes. I'm thinking you've got the Russian standoff going on. You've got the fight between Kenny and Jane. There's a lot of stuff that happens. But this one just kind of you're a prisoner, and then it kind of just fades to black. The only other negative I really have to say, and it's not really a negative, but I am labeling this the best episode, that I do have to say that I don't think A House Divided is as good as Starved for Help, our favourite episode in Season 1. I do think Season 1 has the stronger episode, potentially in the whole of Telltale Walking Dead, to be honest. It's not a bad thing, it is a high bar to beat. I just have to be realistic and say that I don't think this episode is as good as that whole cannibal twist and the emotions and rollercoaster I went through when I played the very second episode of the whole franchise. But enough bitching, we'll get onto the positives. Yep, Kenny reunion is the biggest thing to talk about. It's the whole acting of like Jack mentioned before, you hear the Season 1 music, the nostalgia trips in, you can recognize his voice before you break your way through the crowd. And it's just the fact that that kind of beautiful moment, that love between Clementine and Kenny, just diffuses an argument and makes everyone buddy-buddy. And it's just the facial animation, the way his eyes dart down to you, look up, and then he looks down to you and he just lowers his gun. There's just something really powerful and magical about that whole scene. And I'm actually getting goosebumps talking about it right now. I'm Team Jane, but still, you have to love the scene. You have to respect Kenny and just the fact that he comes back from the grave and you get that really beautiful moment. There's loads of cool scenes in this as well, such as I love a good kill, and you've got the really gnarly Matthew death on the bridge, which is really horrible to see, but it's just so powerful. And I love the way, like Jack mentioned, it affects Walter later on. You've got the kind of horror scene where he's there with the knife outside, and how it can affect Nick's fate. You get the Bonnie debut. This is the first time we see a 400 Days character, and although there is a little bit of flawed logic of her spying on the group, if she got caught she would have been fucked because anyone else would have recognized her, but it was still really cool as a new player to see a 400 Days character in the game. We wanted it to happen, and this was the episode that told us it was happening. I touched on Nick before. The fact that Alvin can die and Walter has to die, it's just, I think it's really strong when a lot of characters can die early doors, because it really reinforces you that no one's safe, and it does make it a lot more kind of tense and scary as you make your choices and play the game. It's also the episode that introduces us to Carver. I'll speak more about his performance in episode 3 because that's really where we get the mainstay of his performance, but the moment we get him at the start, the intro with him was really chilling, and I think Michael Madsen absolutely crushes his performance. I loved the start as well of the episode. You get that variation between Pete and Nick, and it was especially more special for me because I always side with Pete. I think it's the right choice to go for. But when you go back and you play it where you go and see Nick instead, it almost teases it like he has a similar fate, but then you find out he's just drunk. But it was a nice comedic moment, especially if you discover it in that order. And the last thing I am going to mention, and I always do when I talk about this episode, I cannot get enough of that credits song where the animator stepped in and an actual Telltale employee sung the credits song for a really great song that was covered by Lead Belly. or covered by Kurt Cobain, and it is a Lead Belly song, but Little Girl in the Pines, I think the version's called, is absolutely phenomenal. So yeah, House Divided, very worthy of the gold medal. So that takes us to episode 3, In Harm's Way. Now, for me, this episode does take the silver medal. I touched on it briefly before, but it's mainly to do with Carver's performance. Michael Madsen just absolutely kills the role. He's so chilling, the way that he makes, like a dad slap his own daughter. It's just the fact as well that like he sees potential in Clementine, and then he talks to her like, I like the way that you stared me dead in the eye, like really strong. And even in the face of death, he's there saying, yeah, no, this girl's not built better than you guys. She can take this. His whole performance and his philosophy was really interesting. And I think he is the greatest, potentially the greatest villain and, antagonist in Telltale The Walking Dead history. Absolutely love everything about it. It's cool as well for those that saved Alvin. You get a nice hero death out of him. Another thing as well is that like you tend to look at the locations and settings. I love everything about the House Hardware store. Like you get this really big prisoner theme going on, and I know that can be a detriment because you can maybe feel like a prisoner. But whereas I think an episode like Amid the Ruins really lacked that key location, I think episode 3 absolutely smashes it, and it just felt like you were playing an episode of Prison Break, which was pretty cool. I thought Reggie's performance was pretty decent. Famous comedian and actor to do the voice. It was a breath of fresh air. The Carver death, really gnarly. I've spoke about how I love a good death, the way you see his face battered. I liked as well like the fact that Luke's not really in the episode that much, and as you're playing it you have that big mystery of like, oh, where's Luke? And then he comes in later and you want to see how that affects it. You've got the really cool Horde as well, which is like I absolutely loved when that happened. You get the badass Jane introduction. Really, I am a big fan of Jane, and it was really cool to see her beat the shit out of Troy and betray him basically, because Troy's this gnarly piece of shit the whole episode, and then it's just cool to see him get his comeuppance. And yeah, absolutely amazing cliffhanger as well, where you can either kill the zombie or chop the arm off. And it wasn't until we redid this analysis series that I learned that choice actually had a lot of a fairly big consequence and kind of branching into episode 4. And it's just really cool as well to see Kenny do his epic comeback where he's sporting the eye patch. So there's a lot I absolutely love about In Harm's Way, and it was always going to take the silver medal for me. Where it falls a little flat is that I do think, we have to talk about the 400 Days cast. They were a little bit of a letdown. Maybe I'm just being greedy here, but I wanted to see more out of them than just the occasional sort of scene of them saying, oh yeah, you shouldn't keep him waiting. He doesn't like it when you wait. It looked like we were going to get more scenes as well, but it looks like they cut them as well, which is kind of a shame. You also have more of Clem having to do absolutely everything, where she has to go all Mission Impossible. And I think the biggest flaw is potentially the fact they killed off Carver too soon. Although I really like his death, it was really well written. I think he really needed to be in it a bit longer. Jack always voices this idea of how he could be a prisoner. I would have much preferred that. I get they killed him off and then they tried to make it where the Russians and the Harsh Winter is the next nemesis, but the Harsh Winter doesn't have Michael Madsen voicing it, so I don't give a shit. I'd rather have Carver in it for the rest of the game, and it was just really sad to see him killed off. And the other flaws have to be that Nick just becomes an absolute background character, and you might as well have killed him off in episode 2. And I do think the intro to Mike's a little bit weak, the way he's just planted in the game and he acts cold. It looks like he was supposed to be a former bandit, but that plotline got abandoned. And then out of nowhere, he's speaking, to your group around a fire like nothing's happened, and he's just suddenly on your side, and it just didn't really make sense to me. I would have liked a lot more out of Mike this episode. So yeah, very worthy for a silver medal, but enough flaws in there to hinder it from achieving gold.
Okay, so for me, In Harm's Way gets the bronze medal. This is a real tough call, because obviously you can see from my list already that the medals have already been dished out here, and I think the way I look at it is that from episode 1 all the way up to episode 3, this story had momentum, and the momentum was because of Carver. So there's some people out there that might say, actually, so this is the Carver chapter, this is where it's the best. For me, it's actually not, and I've put it in bronze. I think it is partly, it comes back to that point I've mentioned in the other two, it's to do with pacing. Like, with like the other ones, it felt like that you were on the move, that things were going, like characters, situations were arising, and you having to like think fast and all this. You get to this place, and what I would say is that I do think the location is really good, and I like that Telltale tried the dynamic of being a prisoner, because that's something that we hadn't really seen before. Obviously, they flirted with it in Starved for Help, but of course, you know, the situation broke out and you wasn't really a prisoner there for too long. It was far more explored in this particular episode. And I do understand that you have your moments where you do the thing with the seeds or whatever, and then you go to Luke. That's a little bit of a dumb thing for me. Like, how did Luke even get in? Considering it's supposed to be completely cordoned off and whatnot. But yeah, it did feel like you felt like a prisoner. And I think I just naturally like movement. I like things to feel like they're going somewhere. On the flip side though, as Liam said, Carver is such a strong villain. The voice acting was superb, and the fact that like they introduce a likable character like Reggie, and he's not even in it for like what, half an hour, 45 minutes, because next thing you know, Carver's bursting through the door, like chucking him off the roof, which again sets the standard. But I think for me, it's almost what I really love about Harm's Way, and this is why it pushed All That Remains so close but didn't quite make it, is that I love that almost like the two ideologies, and I mentioned this in the analysis, that were like put at play here. You've got Carver, who like represents almost like the Crawford ideology of, you know, weakness will be eliminated, those that aren't capable, you know, will be enslaved and all this. And he tries to do that with Clem a little bit. And then you've almost got someone like a Reggie, and even Luke to an extent, who's more willing to be submissive and more willing to sort of play the slave and be like, you know what, we've got everything good here. We'll lose our freedom in you know, as a means to get all the benefits of, you know, electricity, food, water, and you know, being safe from the walkers. So I thought that was actually really interesting. But ultimately, Carver does get killed off. So this is where I'm like, he needed to be in this longer. I think he needed to be, because if you had all that build up previously, it needed to have a bit of a better crescendo. Like, I like the fact that Kenny was the one that did it, because of the fact that, you know, these two alpha men, you know, really sort of like fighting and wanting to be the dominant one. And of course, obviously, because of the, you know, the fact that he lost his eye from, you know, getting punched to the ground himself. But yeah, like, it does just fall a little bit short, because I just found that when I was comparing 1 and 3 just had a little bit more negatives to it, in my personal opinion. And like Liam said as well, another negative that I'm going to mention is the fact that the 400 Days characters, they could have been used so much better. They could have been part of the group that we met, because I did think that Mike was quite a redundant character. They could have been part of the characters that were, you know, guarding the group, i.e. I look at Troy, for example, but they were just sort of, you know, alluded to a little bit. They had the odd bit of dialogue, but it wasn't nothing. But it really just was Bonnie from the 400 Days that really got sort of the limelight in this episode. So again, that's why it does have another negative. Okay, so we now move on to episode 4, and yes, I mean, we move on to episode 4, and what can I say? I mean, this just finishes rock bottom. I would say this is arguably one of the worst. I've still got to replay A New Frontier, and I've still got to replay A Final Season. Certainly in this season, and certainly comparing it against season 1, one of the worst episodes. What I would say, just to try and be fair to it off the bat, I do wish I had the version at the start, you know, with the Horde, where, you know, that you had the whole thing with Kenny, where you could choose as Clem to axe Sarita in the face or not. I think that would have given it a little bit more jeopardy and an exciting start, because for me it really was just walking through the Horde, an odd bit of dialogue which kind of felt like BS, because it's like, well, you've got all this guts on you and you're now chatting to one another, and we're expected to believe that the walkers haven't noticed that and they wouldn't attack you, you know. On top of that, I think in terms of good stuff, I like the Jane combat lessons. Like, it gives Jane a little bit of airtime, this one. when you're thinking about going to the trailer park and like rescuing the others, she teaches you things that again like are slightly reminiscent of Lee from season 1. You know, you're thinking about cutting your hair, how to fire a gun. This is Jane's way of sort of saying, you know, this is how you take a zombie down. You just kick it in the knee and then stab it in the head. It's all like good character development stuff, so I will give it plaudits for that. And I do like the fact that there is like the branching from episode 3. I'm talking about Nick, you know, of course, sort of episode 2, you could say, where Nick comes forward and he can ultimately be a zombie. But now we're going to get into the meat of it, because there's just lots I don't like about this. For me, when I think of episode 4, there is just a dead middle section throughout this episode. You could have the good start, you could have a semi-decent end with the shootout and the ambush with the zombies. But my God, like some of the things when you're like walking around with Jane, having these like sort of dialogue scenes, maybe I'm being unfair to it, but I just felt like you had a lot of, especially coming from harm's way, where you felt like a prisoner. I feel like you really needed something a bit more exciting this episode, and the fact you had this dead middle section just really didn't appeal to me. And it felt like that you kept coming back to that certain hub, and then maybe you talk to Kenny about Sarita, then you go off with Bonnie and Mike, who, you know, I'm not massive fans of anyway. And you have that sort of pointless choice where do you go in the ticket booth or do you not? Like, it's just, it literally, I think someone put a comment in a video recently, like, if you want an example of why Telltale choices don't matter, this is like the episode to use. Because if you think about the Sarah one as well, do you leave her? Doesn't really matter, because in about 45 minutes she's going to get eaten anyway. So ultimately, yeah, like I will give it plaudits for the ending, because I think, especially coming from Liam's perspective, like if Clem does shoot Rebecca, you've then got that whole, oh my God, you know, I kicked this off, what does this mean in terms of the branching, who's going to die, all this and that. But ultimately, it just felt like a bit of a bore fest.
So yeah, guys, what do Amid the Ruins and Sarah have in common? Neither can be saved, because mine gets the turd as well. So yeah, I mean, I will start off with the positives. There's a raccoon in it, so that's pretty cool. And onto the negative. No, I'm kidding. For real, like, there are a few. Like Jack said, I really like the variety and the branching, like from the cliffhanger with Sarita in the last episode. I always chop the arm off, because that's kind of what you do in Walking Dead, you know, like that is the thing to save someone from getting infected. But just the fact that she ended up screaming and then gets bitten to death and dies, and I didn't get Sarita in my game, and to see Jack's version where Sarita was alive in it but starting to feel unwell, it was really cool to see the variety. And it is just really cool to see the varying levels of Kenny as well, how Kenny can absolutely yell at Clementine. And I do think the episode does really well to kind of like talk about Kenny's mental decline, which does drum up really well for episode 5. And I think episode 4 actually does a really good job in telling Kenny's story. And I do think that it does have one of the greatest Telltale episode cliffhangers, albeit it doesn't lead very well and the payoff of it isn't great, and that kind of harms episode 5. But if I'm talking about episode 4 alone, I think it's good. Like the Russian shoot off, like I think it's brilliant. And like Jack mentioned, for me, I decided to shoot Rebecca myself because I was thinking, time, we need to save this kid. And then all the gunshots went off, and I thought I'm the one who caused the shootout. And I'm not looking at choices. I'm walking into episode 5 thinking, who the fuck have I killed? I thought I fucked up. Bit disappointing to learn that, you know, Kenny just does it himself anyway, so it is a bit of a nothing choice. But without that illusion, I can't tell you how powerful that cliffhanger was to me. But other than that, guys, we are going to go into the negatives to why, and I agree with Jack, why it is not only the weakest episode in the season, but perhaps in maybe The Walking Dead, it's definitely down there as like a low bottom of the barrel episode. I thought the Russians were a poor, unnecessary addition. I feel like this is where you should have had the 400 Days bunch. Why not have them come back as survivors from House Hardware, and you're in a standoff with Vince, Shell, Wyatt and Russell? That would have been a lot more interesting to me, because we kind of have a prior relationship with the characters, and it would have created a really interesting dynamic and maybe some conflicting morals like at that scene. I do think Nick was really poorly written off screen. Sarah was a little bit better, although she deserved much more. but I think it very much mirrors Chuck in season 1 and Ben in season 1, where you had a character who had an off-screen death early doors, and then later on you have someone who has a bit of a hero's death. But I don't know, I just feel season 1 did it better because Chuck went out like a hero and Ben could be saved, and then he got that epic hero speech. I feel Nick's a little poor. He's clearly a background character in episode 3 and he's almost meant to die in episode 2. And I feel like they end his arc so poorly. He had this whole thing going on about how he was full of guilt, how he was incompetent. I feel like Nick really needed a moment to prove himself. So just to see him have a shitty off-screen death where he's just a walker stuck in a fence just felt like really poor to me. With Sarah, I feel like, although it is kind of a good telling story that this is what happens to kids if you don't teach them survival skills in the apocalypse, that I do think there is almost like a really cool moral lesson here. I just can't help but feel she deserved better, and to see her die the way she did. And not only that, but the fact that you can save her earlier, only for her to get killed off, like, you know, 2 scenes later anyway, made it seem a little pointless to me and a little cheap. I'm not gonna lie. Jack said it spot on. The museum section's absolutely tedious, and it does lead into like not only like one crappy choice, but like this episode's got a few going on. Rob Arvo, there's no payoff there. I feel like they could have easily had it if you don't rob Arvo and if you're nice to him, have Mike shoot Clem instead of Arvo. I just feel like you could have like had a little bit, you know, and that wouldn't have been hard to do either. So I feel like they should have just had that in. And then did you hold the baby? I mean, it's just a weak choice. Not Telltale Expanse level of weak, but still, I have to highlight that. And then, yeah, did you or Bonnie crawl through the ticket booth? It's almost insulting that that's at the end screen. So yeah, 3 of the 5 choices were absolutely pants in this. And like I mentioned before, this episode completely lacks Carver. The moment we drop his chilling presence in episode 3, you're just kind of out there with the winter. There's a few Russians at the end, but yeah, it's tedious. I feel like I say locations are almost key in episodes to like remember things. You know, you think season 1, you've got the epic farm. In episode 3, you've got the train. In episode 4, you've got the school. In this episode here, you've just got that kind of like shitty park with like the fountain, and it's just not memorable to me. And it's very grey and kind of like mediocre. So there's just nothing really to ride home about this episode other than the fact that we got a raccoon. And guys, this is where obviously, as you can see on screen, there's only one place Jack and I can put no going back, the final episode. For me, it does take the bronze medal. I'm going to start off with the negatives. Like I said in the last one, the Russian shoot-off, complete letdown. You know, I was waiting months for this, and then the payoff was just horrible. The fact that only one Russian dies, one ends up behind a tree, one's on the ground, and then it's just dumb the way, like, you know, they're shooting at different people even though like there's someone else right next to them. It makes no sense, and it just felt really cheap that that's what we got. I feel it needed way more casualties than we got. Although Luke's death was cinematic, I can't help but feel like he deserved better as well. And it's just the fact that there was a written off, cut off scene where he does get pulled out the lake makes me feel that he was supposed to serve a greater purpose. Potentially of the fact that maybe he was supposed to feud with Kenny as well, because they had the bit of back and forth thing throughout the season, and then for him just to drown in a lake, I don't know. Although it was cool and harrowing, I do feel like they missed a trick somehow. I'll mention it as well, but you got the final choice. Although I love it, I do think Jane hiding the baby just felt really unrealistic to me, and I just don't think it really would be what her character would have done. I'm unsure. It just felt like cheap writing to me. And I do think that it is really epic, and I'll talk about it in the positives, that we do get 5 final endings, but it almost sets up a disappointment for New Frontier, especially if you stayed with Kenny. They absolutely betray his story arc. I do think, like, Jane's, like, although she gets the worst ending over Kenny, I do think her New Frontier one slightly makes sense, and it is a nice little nod back to season 2. But yeah, the way, don't make a game with 5 endings if you're just going to cut them all off into one strand in the next season. To me, that's just really poor and cheap. But yeah, the episode does get a few things right. I mean, I'll talk about Bonnie. You get the cool varied endings. I didn't know she could die at one point. It's cool to see that not only can she die, but she can be nice to you at the end, and you can get evil Bonnie, and it's really cool just to see smoking Bonnie outside calling you a stupid little girl. It's just really chilling to see. I'll leave Jack to talk about the Lee sequence, but it's a good scene. I'll leave Jack to rave about that one. One thing I love as well is just the fact that and this the last thing I'm going to talk about is the ending. I don't think I know a Telltale, maybe Telltale, but Telltale Walking Dead game choice that splits the room to this day. There are Jane fans out there are Kenny fans out there, and then the people that go solo. There's so many people that pick different options here, and I think all of the options are perfectly valid. I think it's written divinely well to the point where, you can almost choose survival and logic versus loyalty and emotion. You've got one man who's got declining mental health where it probably is time to let him go. Or you can be absolutely loyal to him and, drop the girl who probably has more questionable morals, although the more level-headed one. So, I love the fact that it splits the room. I think that's really difficult to do. When often you look at these choices in these games at the end on the graphs, you'll get like a 90-10, 80-20 swing. But yeah, just really epic to see like debates to this day. And, I'm going to always hammer it home. Jack and I will be doing a Jane versus Kenny debate. And yeah, like I just think it's a fascinating topic. And I think the episode does a really good job of kind of like giving us those 5 generous endings, but kind of writing it in a way where you really struggle who to pick. You almost want to pick Kenny, but you don't want to see him murder someone. But in turn, Jane can betray you, and then, you can like choose to go solo. So yeah, just absolutely fascinating the way it ended. And I think it's very worthy of a bronze medal, in my opinion.
Okay, what I'd say for no going back for me, obviously you can see that it finishes 4th. What I would say is that actually this episode has some really iconic moments, which I will go into. So you're probably thinking, Jack, so why on earth does it finish 4th? It comes back to that point. I've probably sound like a broken record, but it really does come back to that whole thing of just storytelling momentum. It really felt like that post Carver's death, something just fell off a cliff for me. Maybe people could argue that the next thing was to get to Wellington. But I think at this point, whereas earlier on in the season, the stakes felt really high, like when Walt died, when Alvin died, you felt something, or you was like, oh, Jesus. You get to this episode, people start dying, like even the way Luke's death was sort of handled, like albeit a very good death, but people just start dropping off like flies, and you're sort of like, oh, well, another one's gone, we're wrapping up the season now. So you sort of slightly, or at least I felt slightly more detached from it until you get to that final choice. So now I think I'll go into like the iconic stuff. Starting off with that choice, yeah, you've got to give it the props. If you're comparing it to season 1, the branching in season 2 is a lot better, and No Going Back is a fine example where you've got the shoot Kenny, save Jane, you've got the go solo, you've got the stay with Jane. I think my personal favourite is what I did in my most recent stream, and is that you don't shoot Kenny, but you ultimately go to Wellington, because again you get such a touching scene, like when he drops you off and you start to see him walk away, and then he stops, slightly looks back, but then carries on forward. It felt such a fitting end, and like Liam said, given what they do with him, if he does stay alive and stay with you in A New Frontier, it's just the best circumstance for me. And again, when you're talking about Jane, it's the whole, why would she randomly do that? It felt out of character, and it's almost like a writing justification to try and make the choice a little bit more awkward between Kenny and Jane, and almost like maybe to push you to go solo. I don't know. I think though, also another iconic moment actually is of course the lake scene, which I do enjoy, because you've got the walkers, this thing with the ice. Do you go to him or not? Again, like I said in analysis, do I think that it could have been handled better? Maybe Carver was there. Maybe Carver instead of Arvo. Arvo runs off and Kenny goes. Maybe that could have been Carver. And maybe that's when everything starts, shit hits the fan. You're thinking, oh, Jesus, do we go after Carver or do we save Luke? That might have been a really good choice. But another thing, talking about another iconic moment, it's that scene with Lee. Honestly, one of the best scenes in, the entire season. Such a good callback to season 1. You're seeing Clem, she's battling the elements, literally, and she's battling, like, this group. She's trying to stay part of it. She's obviously growing up as a young girl. But there's just something so reassuring. You have that scene, she gets shot, and you've then got that reassuring father figure in Lee. And it's just like a nice moment away from all the chaos. where, like, as Clem, you know, she feels safe again. So it was just really nicely done. Again, like I mentioned with the reunion with Kenny, you had the theme of season 1 in there. It was just a beautiful touch to just get that nice little Lee cameo in there, which has been sort of teased throughout the season. If you think about episode 1 with like the photo of him and the conversations with Luke, you know, in episode 2. So yeah, I thought that was really well done. But having said all of that, all of those iconic moments, there's almost like there's filler bits in there as well. You're talking about like the shootout wasn't a good payoff anyway, but then you move on, you've got like in that sort of like electricity pylon-y bit where you're all sat round chatting. Again, it's sort of, I don't know, I didn't realise how important it was to me, because I thought that actually that moments would dictate my thing in this, because obviously episode 2 for me is like got some really good moments in it. The more I think about it, the more the way it's constructed and the momentum of the story actually ends up swinging it for me, because it really does just feel like things come to a bit of a halt and they're almost writing. It's like they're writing something and thinking, oh blimey, we've written ourselves into a corner here, how are we going to wrap this up? Oh yeah, okay, let's just start killing people off, and we've almost got this like showdown thing with Kenny and Jane going on, and that's sort of how it wraps up, and it's sort of a good justification for, you know, Clem going off on her own or ending up with whoever. So there we go, guys. They were our rankings for The Walking Dead Season 2. Do let us know what your rankings are in the comments. Thank you again to everyone that voted and left a comment in our poll. We do really appreciate it. And do stay tuned. We've not finished with The Walking Dead. We're going to be doing more videos on it. And of course, as you know, guys, we're going to probably be covering The Walking Dead Michonne next at some point in the near future as well. So look out for the streams and the upcoming content from The Walking Dead series.
Take care, guys. See you soon.
Catch you later.